Welcome and thank you for joining us for the second Schools Think Next online conversation hosted by British Council Northern Ireland. My name's Michael Arlo and I'm the Head of Education and Society at British Council Northern Ireland. Schools Think Next is a series of online conversations bringing local and international perspectives to vital conversations about learning from the experience of COVID-19, as well as possibilities for longer-term system change. Today, we're delighted to welcome people from more than 30 countries around the globe, including Colombia, the Maldives, Montenegro, Sudan, and the United States. The impact of COVID-19 has given us all an unprecedented opportunity to see the world in a new way and to craft an education system that better meets the needs of our young people. Before the COVID-19 lockdown in March, the Northern Ireland school sector was already preparing for change. The New Decade New Approach deal in January 2020 agreed to an independent review of the education system. Schools Think Next engages with a wide range of local and international educational thinkers, researchers, practitioners, and others to explore answers to two key questions. One, what should be left in the past, and two, what should be embraced for the future. We've already had a fantastic response to our short videos of educational thinkers, including most recently Professor Peter Finn, Andreas Schleicher, and Dr. Anne Looney, who's joining us on the panel today. The wider international online engagement builds on local thinking and provides a platform for sharing ideas and experiences across different countries. Later in the year, there will be more of these videos to come. You can join the conversation by commenting or asking questions today or posting on social media. Why not make your own video presentation for your vision of the future of education? Just make sure you use the hashtag SchoolsThinkNext. Today's event is the second of 3 online conversations, and this one focuses on shared society. Each event includes teachers from Northern Ireland and education experts from around the world. First, just a little bit about how today's event will be organised. It'll be recorded and a video will be available on the British Council Northern Ireland website. If you're on social media, please post about the event today. And again, we're using the hashtag SchoolsThinkNext. And please do follow the British Council Northern Ireland on Twitter. There are closed caption subtitles available so you can read what the speakers are saying, and they are available in English, Arabic, French, Spanish and Portuguese. There's a small button with CC at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, you can choose your language. It's computer generated and may not be completely accurate, and we apologise if there are some translation mistakes. We'll start by asking our panellists some questions to introduce the topic before moving to an open conversation, focusing on what schools and our school system should leave in the past and embrace for the future. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions and to make comments on the topic, shared society. If you have a question or comment, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's for a specific panellist, just add their name. We won't publish repeated questions and comments. Instead, if you see that your post or you see a post that you like or you would like to ask, then please use the thumbs up button. This helps us to identify popular themes to put to the panel. Today, we're delighted to welcome 4 wonderful panellists, and thank you to all of them for sharing their time and experience with us today. We'll hear from Tony Gallagher, who's a Professor of Education at Queen's University Belfast. He's well known for his work on collaborative school networks and the role of education in divided societies. John McCloskey is Head of Religious and Integrated Studies and Learning for Life and Work Coordinator at Shimna Integrated College in Newcastle, County Down. He's been a post-primary teacher for 10 years in 3 different countries. Dr. Anne Looney is the Executive Dean of Dublin City University's Institute of Education, Ireland's largest faculty of education. For 15 years, she was CEO of the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment in Dublin, as well as being on the boards of a number of organisations. She's President of the International Development Association. Yael Maayan is the Director of Education at the Abraham Initiatives in Israel. Formerly, she was co-director of the Education for Peace Department at Givat Haviva, the Centre for Shared Society, where she supported the inclusion of Arabs in higher education. She's currently working towards her PhD at Haifa University. Yael chose to work at the Abraham Initiatives to help establish Jewish-Arab partnership as a central part of her professional life and to bring meaningful change to Israeli society. So welcome and thank you for agreeing to take part in the event today. I should also add that Cathy Gormley-Heenan is meant to be the chair at the minute. We're having some technical difficulties and hope to bring her in. In fact, I think Cathy's ready to come back, are you?
I am here and ready, Mike. Thank you so much for taking care of things while I got myself technologically organised again. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today. We're going to get started. We have a million questions to get through. So I'm going to open the session by starting with our colleague, Tony Gallagher. Tony, I have a question around the historical reasons that Northern Ireland had for the diversity of its school types. Each of the schools has its own distinctive ethos and values. So can you perhaps talk to us a little bit about the pros and cons of such a system?
Thanks, Cathy. Yeah, there's an awful lot written about this, but maybe to try and just get our conversation going, I'll identify 3 claimed disadvantages and 3 claimed advantages. So first of all, on the disadvantages, it's suggested that if you have a divided school system, that helps to reinforce a divided society and limit the opportunities that young people have for dialogue. A second issue often put forward is that a divided school system increases the costs of education and makes the entire system inefficient, or at least not as efficient as it might be. And a third claimed disadvantage is a very particular issue to Northern Ireland, and that is that the churches really shouldn't have a role in schools. That should be a matter for the state. And what about 3 advantages then, claimed advantages for separate schools? Well, the first is that if you have diversity in your institutions, that provides a basis for choice and innovation. Second advantage is that in a divided society, having separate schools recognises and legitimises different identities. And a third potential advantage is that minorities have a right to their own schools, assuming those schools are treated equitably. And the simplest way to do that is to allow them to run their own schools and live with separate schools. So there's 3 claimed disadvantages and 3 claimed advantages.
That's brilliant, Tony. I'm sure we'll come back to those repeatedly over the next hour, but I'll start with some of those disadvantages first and ask John a question. John, how do schools seek to mitigate some of those disadvantages or downsides of a separate school system?
Well, thanks, Cathy, and first of all, thanks to the British Council for the opportunity to be a part of this project. I suppose one of my first thoughts when I hear the term separate school systems is to reflect on the scale of separation in our education system. As a teacher, I find it frustrating. As a parent, I find it dismaying. So broadly speaking, the separation happens along perceived religious lines and often mirrors our residential segregation, leaving 92% of our young people growing, socialising and receiving an education separately. And the downsides are obvious. A lack of exchange fosters misunderstanding. Empathy is often built through experience, and our young people are being systematically denied the opportunity to have these experiences. I suppose it's not an unusual story for someone of my generation to have to wait until they've left school to make a meaningful relationship with someone from the other side. That's to say nothing from those who do not come from or feel association with one side or the other. For me, schools are hubs of creativity, and so mitigate these downsides in a number of ways. They can create experiences which build relationships and provide opportunity to grow empathy. And there are some excellent examples of schools partnering up across the divide to collaborate, not as one-off set piece events, but rather over time, allowing the relationships to develop. I think of the wonderful work done by St Cecilia's College and Lisnead College in Derry, or Kilkeel High School and St Louis in Kilkeel as examples. Schools can also mitigate through curriculum delivery on a daily basis. I'm lucky to teach in an integrated school. Most people will know that we deliberately integrate our students by ensuring a balance of Catholic, Protestant and other faiths and none. We also ensure that an integrated ethos permeates all aspects of pedagogy and curriculum delivery, allowing us to meet our differences head on. We know that we'll disagree, but we've all signed up to the ethos and we're okay with that. Plus, it's much easier to disagree with your mate in history class if you've just copied her French homework at break time.
That's great, John. Particularly, what role do you think that citizenship education plays? You've given some examples there of mitigations, but what about citizenship education particularly?
Well, I think it's in this atmosphere that citizenship education comes alive. Being free to teach the themes of diversity, inclusion, active participation, human rights, democracy, all in a way that's engaging, active and fearless. It brings with it the ability to lift whole generations of students above the quagmire of segregation in order to develop well-rounded individuals who can contribute meaningfully to society, which after all is the overall purpose of education.
Thanks, John and Anne. You've been listening in so far, and I'm sure that you're reflecting on this from the Republic of Ireland experience. So how far have schools in the Republic faced similar types of issues to those raised by John? You're on mute, Anne.
I think that schools in the Republic of Ireland are, depending on, if we take the primary school system, for example, which probably evolved in a similar way to the schools in Northern Ireland, but because society evolves differently, you have schools of particular identities. And yes, that's still a religious identity in many cases, and even schools that are non-religious define themselves in terms of religion. So they're a multi-denominational school, which I think is probably a historic artifact now, and maybe something that we need to think about in terms of schools' identities, even in the Republic of Ireland into the future. I'm the chair of a school board. It's a Catholic primary school. But here's the thing, the boys in the school, and it's an all-boys school, so there's another division, the boys in the school come from all different religious backgrounds and none. So in that sense, it's an integrated school, but what we tend not to need to do, because the children come from diverse communities, is because the school identity isn't mirrored by a particular geographical area. So the students come from a wide variety of backgrounds and communities, and so we have curricular emphasis on developing your own identity, learning, understanding mutual respect, understanding and appreciating diversity. So I think that we're at a very interesting point in the Republic of Ireland where we're still defining schools in terms of religious ethos, particularly at the primary sector. But because of changes in population, that really no longer makes sense, and it's a historical artifact. And as John said, within the curricula, there are very strong emphases on both valuing your own identity and growing up with an identity, but also in all its dimensions, but also learning how to live in a diverse and increasingly cosmopolitan society. I think there's a second issue I'd like to flag though, and that is where you have some recent developments in diversity, and we wouldn't describe ourselves as having a divided system, we'd say it's diverse. So there's different kinds of primary schools, but there are campuses where you've got two different kinds of a primary school. So you'll have a Catholic primary school on the same campus as a multi-denominational primary school, and the children will go in the same gate and then move. Now, if you stand there and look as an outsider, and there are a number of areas in Dublin in particular where this is the case, what you notice is that the students going into one school are a different colour from the students going into the other school. So the identity of the school, the religious branding of the school has become a proxy for something else. And I think that's what makes some of the issues even more complicated. So where it's not just about my identity as a Roman Catholic or my identity as a member of the Church of Ireland, actually it's about social class, about race, about wealth, and all those other layers, and then religious identity becomes a proxy. So I think that it's old and ingrained issue in Northern Ireland that's taking on really new dimensions and complexities in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland.
Thanks, Anne. And of course, whether you're thinking of social class or race or wealth, when you look at a context like Israel, it is in many ways a very different context again. Yael, can you maybe give us a picture of the school context that you're working in to paint as vivid a picture for us as Anne has just painted of the Republic of Ireland?
Thank you, Cathy. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to this event. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss the opportunity education provides to building social cohesion. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm not Irish or even British, but this discussion is very relevant to the work I'm doing in Israel with Jews and Palestinians. So let's go to the context. There are about 9 million people in Israel. 7 million of them are Jews and 2 million are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, above and beyond the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, who are not Israeli citizens. Compared to Northern Ireland, where the conflict between the parties has reached an agreement, between Jews and Palestinians, the conflict still exists. The reality and the relation between the citizens of Israel are affected by this. How does our life look? Jews and Palestinians work together, study together in the same universities, and share, of course, the same public space. But on the other hand, we study in separate education system and usually also live in separate towns. Therefore, we can see, for example, a Palestinian and Jew working at the same hospital, but their children study in separate schools. One learns in Hebrew and one learns in Arabic. The impact of the separation at the school system is huge. Separation shapes consciousness and lead to the creation of racism and preserve inequality between Jews and Palestinians. In a research study we have conducted a couple months ago, we found that this separation continues even in academia. Even when students come to study together in the same educational institution, they are still not interested in social closeness. Between groups, there are a feeling of fear and low motivation to live together. Thank you.
Thanks, Yael, and that's actually a good point to end on with that whistle-stop tour of education in each of the countries that we're looking at. But I want to come to John now to pick up on something that you've said, Yael, about segregation and separation even when people are together. As a teacher, John, how do you work with young people to help them think about the divisions in our society and the way in which we're separated?
Yeah, thank you. The first thing for me is that we need to be brave as teachers. It can be really tempting to avoid or sanitize or skirt around controversial issues, particularly those relating to our past and our history. I feel like we have a responsibility as teachers to make our classrooms a safe and welcoming space for young people to critically engage with our differences and to explore our past in a way that makes them feel valued and respected, and their identities and cultures likewise. What I do is I negotiate an individual contract with every single class that I teach. And the purpose of this is to create an environment where students feel safe to contribute, knowing that their contribution may well cause offence. After that, my job is to teach the skills of debate, appropriate disagreement, mutual understanding and mediation. And that all takes practice. The second thing I think that teachers have to do is to facilitate. We have to become champions of students' curiosity rather than blockers of it. So to give you an example, in 2015, a group of my students approached me at the end of a religious studies lesson. They were upset about reprisal attacks and hate crimes against ethnic minority groups in the UK, particularly in response to the terrorist attacks in Paris. And they wanted to do something about it. Eventually, we came up with the idea of using our platform as a school to give a voice to religious minority groups in Northern Ireland. So I oversaw a project team of students who organised interviews with leaders and members of various non-Christian faith communities in Northern Ireland at their places of worship. We also interviewed those of no religious faith. The project became a documentary called Religious Voices, and the students then made it freely available on YouTube, and they made an accompanying teacher's guide. So for that, the ideas were all the students. The energy was the students. My job was to advise, to steer, and then to sign the funding applications. As well as its use in schools, the resource is now used by the Probation Board of Northern Ireland. The students presented at a training event for the Social Care Council, and a similar project completed along with the Schools Amnesty International Group, looking at the experiences of refugees in Northern Ireland, is currently in post-production. So the impact of experiences like this on the students is enormous. But the wider impact on their peers is also profound, and the legacy is that students wish to explore the differences they see in our society rather than avoiding or ignoring them. And I think we could all learn something from that.
Thanks, John. And I think very much what we've heard is that individual school teacher experience and the engagement that you have with the young people that you're working with. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the system now. Tony, I'm going to come to you on that question. Our New Decade, New Approach deal describes the current system in Northern Ireland as unsustainable. So what direction would you like to see us taking in the future that takes it away from the individual teacher responsibility or school responsibility?
Yeah, the basis for this claim that the system is unsustainable is basically centred around an argument that we have too many small schools, and that small schools are somehow or other financially and educationally deficient. Now, I have to say, I think that is a completely wrong set of premises. I don't think the evidence supports those premises at all. In fact, the biggest problem we have in our school system is savage cuts over the last 10 years that have made it very, very difficult for teachers to do the job that they're professionally capable of doing. So going into the future, I think the first thing we need is a properly funded education system. I think there's no doubt about that. But I also think we need to get away from one of the things we suffer from in Northern Ireland is a very narrow focus on qualifications, as if the number of GCSEs or A-levels that you can get out of a child is the most important thing. Just listening to what John was saying, one of the most important things for a school system in a divided society is to help young people to become active, engaged citizens, to support them, give them the concepts, the language, the ideas, the enthusiasm and the sense of hope that they can become architects of a new future. And John was describing ways in which that can be done, and that I think is should be a much higher priority for our system. And we can do that by empowering teachers rather than having these top-down system-led reform processes which are actually based on a series of administrative criteria rather than any real evidence.
Thanks, Tony, and certainly the narrow focus on qualifications is something that's in the spotlight now with the current pandemic and the pivot away from the way in which we have traditionally looked at that. Have you any observations about what the future might hold as a consequence of the way that we're pivoting now?
Well, there is a discourse around at the moment about trying to get back to normal, and I think that's wrong. There's been massive disruption, huge problems, but we should take advantage of this opportunity because it's cast a lot of things we've taken for granted for such a long time and cast them in a completely different light. One of those things is the basis of examinations and assessment. There's an opportunity now to rethink the way in which we do some of those things, and we should grab that opportunity with both hands. One of the things which has impressed me in this whole process is the way teachers have responded, the way that they're working together, they're collaborating, they're sharing expertise and resources. It demonstrates to me the importance of teacher empowerment, bottom-up processes. That is the engine room of change, and I think that teachers should be freed to be the drivers of change into the future. I think that would take us in a direction which would be much more beneficial to all our young people.
Thanks, Tony. And this notion of properly funded education and the narrow focus on qualifications, some of these things are not particular to Northern Ireland. They're broader issues. So I'll bring in both Anne and Yael here. You know, based on what you've heard so far, what lessons might we be able to learn from both Ireland and Israel about the schooling system there and social cohesion as part of that? Anne, I'll come to you first.
I want to say 100% agreement with Tony. Small schools, massive red herring. Some of the best education that children can get is in a small school, precisely because a small primary school in particular that serves the local community is staffed by a good teacher that can deliver a fantastic high quality experience. So the key is to resource them well, and in particular to enable some kind of leadership and governance structure that doesn't mean that every single small school needs its own individual leadership structure. You know, there are ways around it. I've seen some creative solutions, for example, in the most remote parts of Scotland, where some of the most innovative small schools continue to thrive and be creative hubs for their local community. So I completely agree that that's a red herring. I think there's something that Ireland as an island has that the rest of Europe would give their eye teeth for, and that is that teaching and teachers teachers continue to be trusted, and the quality of our teaching force remains high. Although teacher education, I know, is controversial, in your neck of the woods, Tony, we've done some work in the south in integrating teacher education to our success, to great success. But the standard of our teachers and the quality of the teachers to do the kind of things that John has outlined at the micro classroom level, to reimagine how young people work together, irrespective of the structure of schooling, that is a great asset, and it's an all-island asset. And I think you're right, tapping into the agency of teachers and the agency of students and children in the next round of education reforms, whether they're in Northern Ireland as part of the rethink there, or in the south where we're thinking about the Leaving Cert and our obsession with end of school exams, tapping in to the teacher agency and the student agency, I think will be key to the next phase of reforms for both of us.
Thanks, Anne. Yael, what about the lessons then from Israel?
Okay, so I totally agree that the agency of teacher is really important, but I have to say that we are in Israel, we have a different situation right now, and I would like to share with you that that in 2016 our organization, the Abraham Initiative, adopted the Northern Ireland shared learning model from you, and we still tackle a lot of issues that I will share with you. But let me say that today we have in our program, for example, 40 schools. 20 Jews and 20 Palestinian schools working as pairs. They meet on a regular basis, rotating classes between the schools and learn English together. And in the program, we promote social cohesion and tailored for young teens. It emphasizes the commonalities between the students and deal with diversity, creativity, and media criticism. We are proud to share that even during the Corona crisis, the shared learning in Israel continued to operate. The movement of shared learning in Israel dealt with the crisis with a lot of creativity and innovation. In addition to the running program, we invest significant work in connecting local government officials who support these programs and help us to implement them. Work is still needed for shared learning to be adopted by Ministry of Education. That point is very important. And at present, education for shared living is not an issue in which the Ministry of Education invests large resources. There were attempts by various committees in the Ministry of Education, in which Abraham initiatives, for example, were involved to promote education for shared living to a core subject in our school system, but unfortunately, it did not have sufficient political backing. So this is the place that we stand in, and I think it's a little bit different from your standpoint.
Thanks, Yael, and that takes us really nicely on some of the questions that we've already had in from our audience. So I'm going to try to move us into a more philosophical, open conversation now. So in terms of shared society, is it about developing a shared identity, or is it about creating space for different identities to cohabitate harmoniously? Which, in your view, do you think it is? Is it that shared identity or space for different identities to rub alongside one another harmoniously? And Tony, I'll maybe come to you afterwards for an answer to that as well.
So identity is a subjective experience that is very much related to feeling, memories, and experience. Promoting shared identity can be a delicate and complex process, and one has to understand its sensitivity. The problem we face in Israel is that accepting the other's identity or narrative is seen as a zero-sum game. It can be assumed that, it can be assumed that as different groups take part in positive experience together, it will accumulate and become over time what is called shared identity. But for that to happen, people from different groups in society have to feel that the shared experience do not come and take from them their particular identity. When it happens, groups tend to be in a defense position. In my understanding, the way to create shared identity is through a deep respect for the different identities. Thank you.
Thanks. And Tony?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting question, and it's hampered because in popular, sort of particularly political discourse, identity is often talked about as if it's immutable, it's fixed and unchanging, and is entirely separate for different communities, when in fact it is much more interestingly complex than that. One of the key things that we should be doing in education, whether it's in integrated schools or through collaborative partnerships with schools, is creating spaces for young people to explore and examine aspects of identity. And it's partly about recognizing that different communities do have aspects of their identity which are different, and that's okay. It's also about exploring aspects of identity which are shared, because there's an awful lot more of that than people often give credit for, particularly because of the political discourses and the relationships with fear, which Yael alluded to. But another aspect of this type of engagement is the possibility of formulating new senses of identity, new hybrid forms of identity, because identity is something that's constantly changing. Culture constantly changes. That's what makes it exciting and interesting. And that's something that dialogue can help people to explore in safety and confidence. And I think that's how we should be thinking about identity, not as something that's fixed and has to be defended at all time, but something that's rich that we want to share with other people and explore all the intricacies of with other people.
Thanks, Tony. Actually, that notion of hybrid forms of identity is something that, you know, parents and guardians will play a really large part in how their child forms their worldview and how their child sees themselves and their own identity. So maybe to you, John, how do we bring parents along in this process of sharing, cooperation and integration, given the role that parents and guardians will play?
I think that's such an important question. The theme of today's session is collaboration, and I suppose next to the collaborative relationship between teacher and student, there isn't one that's more important than the relationship we have as teachers with parents and guardians. When there's engagement and participation from parents and guardians, it has such a positive impact on the students' learning, but the opposite can also be true. So for me, it comes down to communication. The pandemic and the lockdowns have already transformed the language that we use when we communicate with parents and guardians, from one of attainment and behaviour to the language of collaborative learning, and I welcome that change. I believe, or at least I hope, that parents and guardians are now getting a never before seen insight into what we're truly trying to achieve in the classroom. And this provides a fantastic opportunity to bring parents along going forward. It's crucial that in our new normal, when we get there, we simply don't, as Tony said, we just don't revert back to the old normal, but that we continue to communicate with parents and guardians about the themes of citizenship and about the role that curiosity, creativity, messiness, failure, resilience, critical thinking all play in the learning process. My dream scenario, and you hear me out on this one, is a dinner table conversation, which instead of seeing the grown-ups nag young people about grades and homework, is one where they're actually discussing the themes of the day's learning. And I suppose finally, look, I come from a school that was founded by a group of parents, some of whom had to remortgage their houses to pay for the school building, and they carried in the desks. So I suppose I, as a teacher, owe it to those parents to honour their legacy by working hard, working my hardest to bring parents and guardians along in the learning process.
That's such a powerful image, John, of parents carrying desks in to set up the school that they wanted. And from the Irish perspective, how have parents been brought along in that process of sharing, cooperation, integration in a new Ireland?
I would say not that well. I think it's an area that is very much a work in progress in Ireland. I think we still have parents will sit on governing boards. There will be a parents association, and there will be engagement with parents, but the engagement is policed and controlled by teachers who still see the classroom as very much where the teacher and the student exercises some kind of control, but the parents are kept out. Now, all that has changed, obviously, with COVID, because now every parent is getting to see every teacher in action, which is really changing the dynamic of any kind of face-to-face engagement. And I would say that it's been illuminating for both sides of the parent-teacher divide. I think I just see a comment there from Gordon talking about a school where he said 85% of the students are newcomers, where's the green and gold, where's the orange and green divide there? It makes absolutely no sense, which kind of bears out Tony's point about changing identities and cultures. But I think the observed behaviour of parents, and I can see it in my own friends, that there is an innate drive in many parents to ensure that their children, even if they find it difficult to say this out loud, but you can watch their behaviour, but there's a fundamental belief that at a young age, integrating, sharing, collaborating, crossing barriers, meeting people from that a very diverse early childhood experience is fine. But the higher up the school they get, the more and more parents are driven by a need to ensure that their children get to hang out and learn with children who look like them, sound like them, dress like them. There's a real drive to, parents are nervous about their children in a diverse setting. And I've seen that myself in my own generation. And that could include special educational needs children. It includes integrating newcomers, a real nervousness about difference. I know that's well documented in a number of research projects, that John's parents were a group of parents who found each other and then found a school to match their needs. But very often parents themselves are still not completely comfortable with diversity. So that makes what John does with children and young people even more so that they can begin to have those conversations. And if you think of the Republic of Ireland and recent changes in the law on everything from marriage equality to divorce, how that was driven intergenerationally, where young people started the debate but then got their parents involved. I think that has been significant. But there's definitely an intergenerational challenge, and some of it is parental concerns that a more diverse educational setting is not as good quality as all the girls in one school in tartan skirts and all the boys in another school in blazers. And we need, as educators, to blow that myth out of the water. And the kind of education that John gives is high quality in academics as it is highly creative and engaging.
Thanks, Anne. And that sense of nervousness about difference or desire for homogeneity the further up a school system that you move sits in contrast to what you often hear about the importance of international connections for students in terms of how that might help them explore their own identity and culture vis-a-vis that international connection that they might have. You will have all had experiences of international connections with pupils in different ways. Can you maybe each of you, I'll come to all four of you, reflect a little bit on how the international piece might help our own pupils explore their own identities and cultures? So I'll start with Tony.
Okay, one of the things I've been working on for quite a number of years in Northern Ireland now is helping to build collaborative networks of schools, Protestant, Catholic and integrated schools, and getting students taking classes in each other's schools and teachers working together. One of the things which we didn't expect but are very pleased to see is the way that this idea has been picked up in a number of other divided societies and adapted for use within their own context. You can't just drop it in, you've got to adapt it to those circumstances. And we very quickly realised when we got teachers and sometimes young people from these different countries engaging with one another, that provided another source of new ideas, new experiences, and new innovation. And that for me is what's crucial. We talked earlier about the importance of dialogue as a way of sharing different experiences. That can happen within one society, but it happens between societies as well. There's nothing that reminds us more of the richness of humanity and the richness of life by hearing about other ways of doing things. It challenges us to think about some of the things we take for granted, think about our assumptions, and gives us access to new possible ways to reimagine ways we do things. And I think that is wonderful. And that type of international connection, I think, is absolutely crucial, hugely educational.
John, what's your sense from the teacher perspective?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear all of those views. I suppose I would trust my students to take the lead on this. the students are so aware of the world around them. You walk into any classroom in Northern Ireland and ask them who the president is, and I guarantee very few of them will say Michael D. Higgins, despite the fact that he's our nearest geographical president, I suppose. They're so aware of world events. And I think as a teacher then, the skill is in taking those international events and teaching with them, but using them as a safe way to approach our, I suppose, the issues that we're facing in our society. And of course, those international experiences are also in our society. Our demographic is changing very quickly, and our education system isn't keeping pace with it. I don't think it's even trying at this stage. So I suppose my message is take the students' lead on this, trust the students.
Yael, what has been the experience in Israel? I know that the study visits to and from Israel are constant, points of political comparison, points of school comparison, the international connection for pupils in Israel in terms of how it helps them shape their own identity and culture. What's been your observations on that? Oh, I think you might be frozen. So Anne, if I can come to you on that question first while we try to get Yael back again.
Well, actually, I wanted to comment on John. Oh, am I mute? No, I wanted to comment on John's point there about education not keeping pace with other changes in society. I think when you find yourself, making a statement like that about the education system where you work, and yet education is supposed to be the driver of innovation and change, if you begin to observe that education is lagging behind, that is a serious issue, not just for the education and school system, but for economic and social development more generally. And I think all, systems are struggling a bit now because the pace of change is so accelerated. It puts pressures on education systems, and many are trapped in old qualifications frameworks, and in the South we're struggling to change, but there's a recognition that change is coming in student engagement. But I think looking to the future and to the kinds of debates that are happening in Northern Ireland now, starting from a point where there's a recognition that education is not keeping up, is a great impetus to bring people into the debate. And the debate does need to include the economic community, those concerned with social and cultural life, and to begin to say, look, we have an education system that doesn't belong to the 20th century. There are bits of it that go back even further, and the rest of us are moving on, and we now need to take it with us. I think that has been an impetus in the South for change. But I was really struck, John, by that statement, and just what a risk that is in a school system if it's not driving the change, or at least responding to the change, or even criticizing the change. But if it's simply not keeping up, I think that's a real risk, I think.
And I think actually the language that we can use, Anne, sometimes doesn't keep up as well. So if I take this as an example, one of the questions that we've had submitted from the audience, or comments submitted, is defining integration by religious affiliation seems very last century. So the question is, should the term integration be considered for a much broader range of diversity, including that social, academic, cultural, political diversity, and also the inclusion of students recognised with disabilities in mainstream schools? Have we got the definition or defining integration by religious affiliation wrong, that it's very last century and not keeping pace with where we are? That's a question to everyone, but I'll begin with Tony again.
Okay, well, on one level, the notion of integration should be a much broader discourse around inclusion, and we should be striving towards having schools that are more inclusive, because very often in Northern Ireland, too often we've talked about schools being defined by who they keep out, not who they let in. So on one level, that's right. At the same time, and just to pick up on a point that John made earlier on, the integrated school sector in Northern Ireland is really a quite extraordinary and wonderful thing, because it's one of the few examples of a school system anywhere in the world that was created primarily because of the commitment and the energy and the enthusiasm of teachers. So that's a really, really important, background for that system. I suppose within the context of Northern Ireland, the society has changed. There are lots of newcomers, new people who have arrived, new identities, and that's important. Quite a lot of people have cast off some of the old traditional identities, and that's important. At the same time, there remains a strong fault line within a political fault line within our society centred around religious identity, and we shouldn't and can't ignore that. We can't just wish it away. It's still a problem we have to address. So, despite all the complexity, that is a reality which needs to be addressed. For me, what's in a sense so last century is the notion that an individual school can provide everything that a young person in that school needs. If you look around the world, the way in which school systems that are striving towards being world class, being excellent, what they're doing is encouraging collaboration, not only within the school, but between schools, getting students and teachers working together for the local community. That requires teacher empowerment. It requires support for collaboration. We have the potential coming out of our experience of this last 12 months. Suddenly we're using IT in all sorts of more interesting ways. So there's an opportunity for more innovative use of IT coming out of this situation. The other big thing which has emerged in this, or has been writ large in this crisis, is the way in which we were really not seriously dealing with inequalities in the system. The inequalities have been exacerbated by the situation that we're in. So when we get out of this, that has to be a priority, to try and address those inequalities in a realistic way, because there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't have an education system that is both excellent and equitable. World-class systems achieve both of those things. There's absolutely no reason why in Northern Ireland we shouldn't have the same.
John, let's bring you in here.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, and much of it's spot on. I'd like to start with the final sentence, that defining integration by religious affiliation seems very last century. And that's because it is last century, specifically the 1989 Education Reform Order. I suppose at that stage, deciding on which labels to use, perceived religious affiliation was the least objectionable path. And I find the questioner is absolutely correct that we need to be forward-looking, and that's something that we're not great at in this country at times. I personally can't wait to see the 2021 census results. And I think schools and education systems must move quickly to develop school systems and a curriculum which is truly for and about everyone in our society, not just those who share the power. In terms of the range of diversity mentioned in the question, I would stress that our schools integrate in so many ways, not just along perceived religious lines. There are places of education, which, what Anne said earlier, they have to be places of high expectations. We have to provide an excellent education to those of all faiths and none, for all abilities, cultures and backgrounds. And it has to have that ethos and praxis of inclusivity at its core. And if we can get to that stage, that sounds pretty 21st century to me.
And Dan, we started with you because you'd raised the point about nervousness, about difference and so on. So is that sense of integration, in your view, how does that sit with those previous comments about the desire for homogeneity and that sitting at odds with some of this?
Because I think that what Tony and John have both said challenges any impetus to homogeneity, because if you're able to get to a place that says we have a world-class education system that values and promotes excellence, equity, and has high expectations for everyone. I think that, John, you brought in the issue of expectations. If you take those three E's, right, that it kind of might form the kind of basis of an education system. I think that if we can provide parents with the evidence that balance between excellence, equity, and expectations benefits every child, including yours. That is where your child will thrive. That is how they will learn to navigate the complex world that we live in, and meet new challenges and be creative. and pass examinations or whatever else we expect of them, then I think we're taking a big step in terms of reform. You know, when I was the chief executive of the NCCA, of the Curriculum Council in the South, I sat at many meetings where you would encourage, where parents and teachers and everybody would sit around a whiteboard and put up all the key words that they wanted from a school system, and the 3 E's were in there. And then it would be followed by the C's, you know, a system that's creative and critical, where there's opportunities to collaborate, where there's, you know, there's an imaginative outburst in the education and student agency, and they would all nod sagely. But actually underneath it all, what they wanted was that would be great for other people's children. But I would like my child to go to a very traditional schools where they pass examinations, because the credentials, the access, the power. So over time, we've worked very hard to try and, you know, bring those expectations together and say we can have high academic standards and an inclusive system, and they're not mutually exclusive. But the education imaginary, the default image in many people's heads of a good school is still one that is preparing people for qualifications, Tony, examination results, and grinding people through. And there's a bit of a way to go there to get that message changed. But I think it's changing. I think the experience of people in communities, I think the experience of the last 12 months, which shows that traditional imaginary is not as resilient as we think it is, and may not be resilient into the future, is really throwing up some good questions for systems north and south of the border.
And we've actually had a question on that, Anne, specifically. So looking ahead, do we think that there will be any changes to the current school system with controlled, maintained and integrated schools in the near future? So question for everybody. I'll begin with John this time. Do you think there'll be any changes to the school system, given everything that we've heard and talked about, and of course the current context that we find ourselves in?
I certainly hope so, because there needs to be changes. What this pandemic has served to highlight is that we have some major frailties in our system. I would like to see much more of a focus, and not just lip service, put on building resilience, positive mental health and creativity in our schools. But if you like, we can do this at the expense of constant testing and retesting just for the sake of testing. I think we also need to work a lot harder to bridge the chasm experienced by those students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which Tony mentioned earlier. And again, the current situation that we find ourselves in has only served to highlight and exacerbate those barriers. And then finally, I would welcome a shift away from segregated school models to truly integrated and shared education. As David Hume's famous fallacy says, just because something is and always has been a certain way does imply that it ought to be that way. We just need to be brave enough to do it.
Tony, it's the $64 million question. Do you think that there'll be any changes to the current school system?
Yeah, well, a bit like John, I really hope so. And I'm a little bit optimistic, despite the fact that, I mean, I've had a long career working in education research. And over those years, there have been many big debates about change. But what almost consistently happens is that change is blocked and things stay much the same as they were. And maybe that's part of the reason why the education system in Northern Ireland has so many conservative, old-fashioned features to it. But I think change is necessary, and the disruption which has been caused recently has highlighted so many issues and called into question so many assumptions that I think there has to be a process of change that comes after this. One of the most important things that we need to, that I hope will come out of this, that we need to think about, is the point about that John raised about expectations. We don't have a world-class system because for years and years and years, our system has been rooted in a set of prejudices on the capabilities of young people. That young people, some young people are capable of some things and other young people aren't. The current prejudice that we have is that 10-year-old children can be divided up into academic and non-academic children. Those are nonsense categories. For me, a 10-year-old child is a bundle of potential with a lifetime of opportunity and hope ahead of them. And our education system should be designed to try and bring out that potential and work to that hope. And that's where I think the route for change has got to come from. And I hope that out of this very, very difficult situation that we've been in, that we will have an opportunity to address that, but we will get some change in the future. Things that have happened over the last 10 years that I've seen with the development of the shared education networks and a lot of stuff that I've worked with for many more years within integrated schools gives me a great sense of hope that if you release teachers, release their professionalism, empower them, they can be the real engines for change in this process.
Tony, I'd written that comment down, teacher empowerment. You've said it a couple of times during the course of the last hour, and I'm going to bring Yael in on this point exactly. We've had a question, Yael, for you that says, from your experiences, what's the greatest challenge that teachers have in Israel and Palestine when working towards effective reconciliation practices for its citizens? So what's been the challenge in terms of teacher empowerment in that space?
Okay, so let me remind you, we are speaking inside of Israel, okay, only the Israeli citizens, Palestinians and Israelis. I think, of course, that the political thinking and the ability to be critique is not such an, is not such an opportunity that teachers have in Israel. I think that because we don't have an agreement, teachers fear from, saying what they feel, what they think. I think it's something that need to be changed but it can be changed only through an agreement. I would like to say, some last words that as I said, we hope that in few years we will be able to see that the shared learning as an inherent part of the Israeli education system. We know that even there will be quite few challenges, but still it will be a very big leap forward for the Jewish and Palestinian society in Israel. And I would say that, although there is still no vaccine against racism, we know that education can overcome the consequences of segregation and increase motivation for social closeness. In order to create the impact there is the need to, for a long-term regular programs, be it in an evolving way from early age and throughout the school years. So this is my answer.
Thank you, Yael. And as we come to the hour end, I just want to give our other three panelists the opportunity to give our audience, we've 33 countries here with us today, that one key takeaway message from each of you. So John, I'll start with you.
So collaboration for me is the mechanism which allows us as a society to move forward in an inclusive, diversity respecting manner. We all as a society need to drive the integration in our own lives. It cannot simply start and end at the school gates. What we need from our leaders and decision makers is courage. We cannot just sit and wait expectantly for a segregated system to integrate itself from within. We owe it to our young people to provide sustainable models which facilitate frequent, ideally daily contact across our divides. Then we need to train, equip, and trust our teachers to make it fly. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion.
Thanks so much, John. Anne, over to you.
I'm going to quote John for my final comments, and that comment about education not keeping up with other changes in society. And if education is the site on which we prepare the next generation to live, to thrive, to have families in the changing society, then the scale of failure is huge, and we have a responsibility as system leaders to speak out, to tackle that, and to really move the system so that it can help prepare our young people to live in the complex world we've only just glimpsed in the last few months.
Thanks, Anne. And Tony, last word to you.
You said, Cathy, you pointed out I've been talking about the empowerment of teachers, and I'll say it again because that's right. We should trust teachers. They are professionals. They are consummate professionals. They have the interest of the young people at their heart, and we should get off their backs and let them get on with exercising their expertise and their professionalism. That's the best way we could make things better.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tony. And thanks to all of our panelists. It's always impossible to get through everything that you want to, but to everyone who's joined us today in our audience, thanks for joining us. I hope that you've enjoyed the event very much. It would be great to be able to carry on the conversation on social media because the clock has beat us now, and perhaps we can get the answers to the questions that we didn't have time to ask today in this session. Just remember to use that hashtag SchoolsThinkNext, and then we'll be able to find it more easily. So the next and final Schools Think Next online conversation is at the same time on Wednesday, the 24th of February, and the registration for that will open soon on the British Council Northern Ireland website. And the theme for that will be Vision 2030, something that we've picked up a little bit on today. What will the future look like and what those changes might be? So in the next day or so, you will receive an email from us with a link to our feedback form, and we'd love to get your views on this event to inform our planning for the future events that we'll hold. Again, thanks very much for joining us today. We're looking forward to seeing you on social media to continue our conversations. And don't forget, we would also love to see you post your own 2-minute videos and share your vision with us for the future of education. Thanks very much, everybody. Goodbye.